All right, today we're going to do factoring expressions. So factoring expressions is kind of the inverse of the distributive property. So you are going to find the greatest common factor and factor it out of both of your terms. Then, once you have your expression, you can use distributive property to find out if your solution is correct. The first step is to find the greatest common factor of both of your terms. Some of us can do this mental math, but if your term is, if you're not sure, the best way is to find the greatest common factor. You can list the factors like I did here. So, for example, 1 and 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6. And for 24, it would be 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 times 8, 4 times 6, and so forth and so on. So the greatest common factor here, if I look at the common factors, we have 1, 2, 3, so these are common, these are common, these are common, 6, and then there's nothing else in common. So I know my greatest common factor is 6. The other way is to do a factor tree, prime factorization. So for 24, it's going to be 6 times 4, which is 2 times 3, which is 2 times 2. And you keep going until you have all prime numbers. And for 18, 6 times 3, 3 is prime, 2 times 3, and these are all prime. So in this scenario, if you're going to do it this, so for 24x equals 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times x. And for 18, 2 times 3 times 3. Then you find your common factors. So they have 2 in common, my pairs, and 3 in common. And that's it. So 2 times 3 equals 6, which again, we've already said that the 6 is the greatest common factor. Once you've found your greatest common factor, 6, whether you're doing factor rainbows or whether you're doing prime factorization or mental math, the most simplest way that you can approach this problem is to basically, you're dividing both of your terms by your greatest common factor. So I'm going to divide by 6, divide by 6. So when I start to write my problem, my greatest common factor is going to come out of the parentheses. And then in the parentheses is going to be my solution for these terms. So 24 divided by 6, 24x divided by 6 is 4x. And remember, I always tell you to carry the sign with it. So a minus 18 and a negative 18 is the same thing. Even if you do stop and add the opposite. So if I stopped and added the opposite, it's still a negative 18. So negative 18 divided by 6 is going to be negative 3 or minus 3. So this would be your final answer. This would be your final answer for factoring expressions. Now remember, I told you in the beginning you can use distributive property to see if your solution is correct. So 6 times 4x is 24x, and 6 times a negative 3, remember, carry the sign with it, is negative 18, so you know your solution is correct. Now, some problems, you might approach them a little differently because you won't need to do all the greatest common factor and everything. You might know mental math. 15x and 25. The greatest common factor for 15x and 25 is simple. It's going to be 5 because we know there's only 2 factors. 3 times 5 is 15 and 5 times 5 is 25. So I know the GCF is 5. So I'm going to divide both of these out by 5. I'm going to write on the outside of the parentheses the greatest common factor. Then I'm just going to solve. 15x divided by 5 is 3x, and 25 divided by 5 is 5, and it's a positive 5, so bring the sign with it. That would be your final answer. So you don't always have to do, prime factorization or a factor rainbow listing all the factors that multiply into that number. Sometimes you just may know that the greatest common factor, you might know it through mental math. Just so you know that you have to have the greatest common factor for this to be solved in most simplest form. Okay, The other problem that I wanted to talk to you about is when you approach fractions. Sometimes it'll give you the greatest common factor, and it'll tell you factor out. So, for example, factor half out of half x plus 3 over 2. So it's telling you what to factor out. You don't have to find anything. It's telling you to factor out the half out of this expression. So if I'm not really sure, or fractions kind of confuse me or complicate me, you know that fractions, you're always gonna, you can multiply by the reciprocal to get rid of a fraction, correct? Which means that the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2 over 1, and when you multiply them together, you get 1. So for this problem, the easiest way to approach it is, maybe let's just take the half x. How can I simplify this? What is that telling me to do? If I'm finding out the factors of it, it's basically saying that half times x. And for 3 over 2, if I want to factor this out, 3 over 2 is half times 3, or 3 over 1. 3 over 1 is the same as 3, and that would give me 3 over 2. So to factor this out, I can say, okay, well, I know half. Half is going to be my first problem because they already told me to factor out that half. So the half is factored out, and I can think to myself, half times what equals half x? Well, half times x. Now, half times what is going to equal 3 over 2? I already said that half times 3 equals 3 over 2. So if I place a positive 3 here, half times 3 will equal 3 over 2. So that would be my final answer. If I want to use the distributive property to see if it's correct, half times x equals half x, and half times 3 equals a positive 3 over 2. And then that's it. So just work with numbers. Some of it could be mental math. Some of it you might have to find the greatest common factor. And you can always use distributive property to check your answer.